Hi everyone. My name is Payam Piray, and I'm a postdoc at Princeton University. So today I'd like to talk about planning and how we can reuse computations in a flexible way. Um, a central theme in neuroscience in the past decade or so has been that there are two types of decisions: deliberative plans versus fast-paced study habits. An influential line of research modeled these with two types of computational reinforcement learning models: model-based versus model-free. But this research leaves the biggest question, in a way, unanswered. How does a brain plan? In fact, the model-based system in this framework has been treated as some kind of a magic box that can do all good and perfect computations, but it offers no realistic process-level computational model for planning in the brain. Reinforcement learning models are based on ideas of Richard Bellman. And Bellman first defined value function, which is how good that each state is in the long term. And in the so-called Bellman equation, you see that value of the current state is given by reward plus value of the best next state. The problem is that you don't know value of next state. So, and in fact, this is not a closed form solution because you have value on both sides of this equation. This is just a definition of the problem in a way. So Bellman introduced an iterative algorithm that scans the environment and updates values using the Bellman equation. This is called dynamic programming. But the dynamic programming has a big problem. It cannot replan. And we know that animals can replan. Actually, animals are really good at replanning. So in fact, expensive computations in the dynamic programming are not reusable. If the environment changes even slightly, then dynamic programming has to start from scratch and runs the whole dynamic programming again. For example, assume that the dynamic programming has already solved the problem to go to A in this example. If we now slightly change the goal to a state B, for example, dynamic programming has to solve the problem from scratch. It has to run the whole program again. And as I said, it is important that there are lots of evidence that humans and animals, even rats, are really good and efficient at these kind of replanning tasks. And we knew about the problem for actually a long time. To address the problem, at least to some extent, an algorithm called successor representation was proposed about 30 years ago. The main idea is to keep a map of long-term, kind of like long-range occupancy under the current decision policy. But successor representation also fails to do replanning efficiently. The problem is that if the environment slightly changes, the old decision policy is not useful. In other words, successor representation stores a representation of state occupancies under a policy which is not useful for the current task. For example, if the goal slightly changes, like being moved from a state A here to a state B, the old policy is not useful. And therefore, successor representations fails to replan. So again, unlike animals, successor representation cannot replan efficiently. Recently, we have developed a new model that uses expensive computations efficiently and can replan similar to animals. It solves all replanning problems, such as goal revaluation problems, but also problems in which the environment changes. So for example, if a new wall added to the environment. The new model is called linear reinforcement learning. Also, the model exposes connections between planning and a number of important problems in neuroscience, including neural representation of cognitive maps in the entorhinal cortex, and also cognitive control and biases in decision-making. So this is the outline of this talk. I first present the model and show you why and how the computations in this model are reusable. And I show you implications of the model for replanning and its connections to intrainum maps. Finally, I talk about biases in decision-making and how the model explains those biases. Let me first present the model. The model is built on work in control theory by Imo Todorov. Actions in the linear RL model are chosen based on a decision policy. But the model also has another policy. And this policy is a kind of like a technical term in reinforcement learning. I think most people know what it is, but basically it is a distribution over actions. It's a probability distribution over actions. So, but the model, in addition to this decision policy, has another policy called default policy. The model changes the decision policy according to reward, but changing the decision policy comes with the control cost. The control cost is given by the discrepancy between the decision policy and the default policy. So more changes of the decision policy results in larger control costs. In fact, if we think about the problem in a Bayesian way, the default policy is kind of a prior over the decision policy, and the control cost term is a regularization term. So in fact, the model maximizes reward minus control cost. So the objective function here is slightly different than the original problem, in which the objective was to maximize reward. But there are two good news here. First, unlike the original problem, which was not analytically solvable, and thanks to Tom, we know why that is the case. This one is analytically solvable, and we do have a closed form solution here. That's a huge computational advantage. Second, although this solution is slightly different than the original problem, but it's actually a very good approximation of the solution to the original problem. In fact, if we assume that the default policy is uniform, which means that there is equal probability for all available actions, then the model almost always behaves optimally. And importantly, in this case, the model can also do flexible replanning. If the default policy is biased, meaning that it's not uniform, then the behavior of the model is also biased. I first talk about the uniform side of the model. The analytical solution that I talked about is this one. First, you see here on the left-hand side of this equation is the exponential of value. But importantly, on the right-hand side, you see no value. So this doesn't have the problem of Bellman equation. It's a closed form solution for value. This equation factors the solution into two independent pieces, M, which is called the default representation. And it depends on the default policy, and G, that only depends on the goal. This solution across all states is a matrix times a vector. And so it's a linear equation. That's why it's called linear RL. Also, this means that it can be implemented with a single layer neural network. I also like to emphasize that we did not engineer this equation. This solution emerges naturally by assuming the control cost term. So it's what we get if we solve the Bellman equation for the new problem. I focus on the default representation because it's the only term, because it's the only term that is expensive to compute here. But there is one main point. The default representation is reusable, and that enables the model to replan efficiently. This equation is the formal definition of the default representation. Here, C is a vector representing cost across all states. And P default is a matrix of one-step transitions under the default policy. The default representation is, in fact, a sort of map representing long-range dependencies in the environment. So it is similar to successor representation, actually, but does not have the main problem of SR. It does not depend on some old policy. And importantly, unlike SR that is not useful under a uniform policy, this one is actually very useful under a uniform policy, a uniform default policy. That's because the linear L, unlike SR, does not replan the decision, does not replace the decision policy with a default policy, but uses the default policy as a prior over the decision policy. So if we have an amazing environment like this, this matrix is actually sparse and it is semi-diagonal. It is sparse and it looks like this because it represents one-step transitions, right? So every state can only be connected to its neighbor states. That's it, maximally. So also it is a very big matrix. If the environment, if the maze, for example, the size of the maze is 10 by 10, this matrix is 100 by 100 because its size depends on the number of states in the environment. But the default representation M is the inverse of this matrix. So unlike the first one that represented one-step transition, the default representation actually represents long-range dependencies. So the main computation here needs a matrix inversion. And we all know that matrix inversion is computationally really expensive. And also, this is the nature of the problem. Other reinforcement learning models have to deal with it one way or another. For example, successor representation is actually inverse of a matrix that depends on the current policy. There are different ways to compute this matrix, for example, learning or replay, but because it's a big matrix anyway, it takes a lot of time. But it's a very useful representation because it is reusable. To see that, let's assume that there is a change in the environment. For example, we add a new wall to this maze. The key point in this model is that we do not need to do the whole matrix inversion every time there is a change. Instead, as we showed in the paper, we can use matrix algebra and wrote the new matrix as the sum of the old one plus a new term. And as you see here, the change term is actually not local. And we knew that. We knew that adding a wall, it doesn't only affect like the neighbor space or like a local space. It affects the whole problem. It's a big matrix itself, but importantly, it's a low rank matrix, which is easy to compute. Let's focus on the M-change matrix here for a moment. The M-change matrix is the product of three terms. A column matrix, which is basically some columns of the old M related to a state next to the wall. So it's already available. A row matrix, which depends on the rows of old M, so also available. And a small matrix in the middle, which needs some computation, but its size depends on the size of added wall. So it's like a much smaller matrix. So this transformed the problem from dealing with a matrix that its size is equal to the size of whole state space to a new one that its size depends on the size of added wall. Also, I should emphasize that this equation is not merely an approximation. In fact, we can compute the new one both exactly and efficiently. This is indeed the nature of the problem. So now I show you implications of the model for replanning and also for entrained maps. I first focus on a replanning task called the detour task. The detour task was developed by Edward Tolman, a renowned psychologist who introduced the concept of cognitive map. Here, animals have three routes to get to food, and rats are smart enough to choose the shortest path during the training phase. In the test phase, Tolman blocked the shortest path and tested which route animals take. That shows the second shortest path on the very first trial. So Tolman concluded that animals have a sort of mental representation, a sort of cognitive map of the task, and they can manipulate their cognitive map to choose the best possible action. The default representation M should change because the environment has changed. But as you saw, the new M can be written as the sum of the old one plus a new term, and the new term, the M change, is easy to compute. So the model shows similar behavior as Tolman rats and can replan efficiently by reusing M computed in the training phase. The final point is that M and M change are related to grid cells and border cells in entorhinal cortex, which is the region thought to be the neural substrate of cognitive map. There are 2 points here. First, regarding implementations of these computations in the brain, I've shown that M is built up from some of the things that look like grid cells, and this M change actually also lives in entorhinal cortex. It's whole another class of cells called border cells. And what is cool is that this part actually represents the added wall in the detour task. Second point is that the model gives a computational reason of why there are different types of cells for maps and submaps. The reason is that this representation allows for efficient reuse of computations for planning. Good evaluation tasks are even easier to solve here. For example, let's consider a task called time and latent learning task. In this task, there is a maze with 2 end boxes with equal amount of food. So in the training phase, rats choose either end box 50% of time. Then there is a revaluation in which the left end box is paired with the shark. The main point of this procedure is that Thomas did not allow animals to run through the maze and go to the end box and experience the shark. Instead, the shark was given in the left box. In the left box, when it was detached from the maze. Okay, I should use microphone more. So the shark was experienced independent of the maze. The main point, the main question of Tallman was that how animals behave when they are back to the maze. The question is whether they can replan and incorporate the new piece of knowledge in their decisions. He found that they choose the end box that was not paired with the shark on the very first trial. So they were able to replan efficiently. Actually, in the first version of this experiment, or at least the version that I read in Thomas' paper, out of 23 rats, 21, they were able to do this. So it's a really huge effect. The model can solve the problem because it can replan by substituting the new G, because here only goals have changed, into the equation. And the default representation M computed in the training phase is untouched. So the point, again, is that the model reuses the default representation computed in the test phase to replan, computed in the training phase to replan in the test phase. So as you see in this simulation, the model chooses the 2 end box equally during the training phase, but then chooses the right end box during the test phase. So it shows the same behavior as Tallman's rats. How much time? 10? 1? Okay. Another aspect, I was seeing to this. Another aspect of the model is that it is related to decision biases and how we can override them. So far, everything was with the assumption that the default policy is uniform. What if the default policy is biased? In this case, the model also shows biased behavior. There is a computational reason for why sometimes it's better to have a biased default policy. In fact, as I said before, the default policy acts as a kind of a Bayesian prior over the decision policy. And we know from Bayesian statistics that if there are stable regularities in the world, it's computationally beneficial to have priors that are relatively matched with those regularities. If the default policy is biased, the model shows a sort of a soft bias behavior. It's soft because the model can override its biases, like people. To override its biases, however, it needs reward because, as you saw, there is a trade-off in the model between reward and biases due to control cost. And this aspect of the model can explain a range of biases in decision-making, such as emotional biases, cognitive control, and Pavlovian instrumental transfer, and of course, and also habits. In the paper, we have covered these topics extensively, but here I just mentioned the cognitive control. So a Stroop task is typically being used for studying cognitive control. In this task, subjects are asked to do either color naming and word reading, and color naming is more difficult than word reading. So in the model, we can say that the color naming action is less likely under the default policy. Therefore, within the model, the color naming is more costly due to the control custom, which is consistent with the fact that for people, color naming feels costly. And if we measure Stroop error, which is the amount of error when subjects are asked to do color naming, we see this pattern. What is really interesting here is that promising reward helps subjects to reduce the Stroop error. So the bias here is actually a trade-off. This is exactly what previous models cannot explain, because there is no trade-off in those models between biases and reward. The linear RL model, of course, shows the same behavior because there is an intrinsic trade-off in the model between reward and control cost. This goes beyond the previous computational approach that we use decisions as a dichotomy, as either plans or habits. Graded biases and graded habits emerge naturally within the model. Let me summarize the talk. I introduced linear reinforcement learning, which is a realistic model for planning and replanning. That was because the model was able to reuse expensive computations flexibly and efficiently. The model connects planning to entrain on response fields, such as grid cells and border cells. And also I showed you that the same model also provides a computational explanation for biases in decision-making, such as those in cognitive control. I'd like to thank Nathaniel, though, who contributed in this work. And what I presented today was all published in this paper. If you are interested, like there are a number of ongoing work that we are pushing this model, especially on map making, I can say. Okay, thank you.